Well, I have to say the Met's behaviour over all of this has been really astonishing. 1 minute they're going to, the next minute they're not. Really very, very odd. But not as odd as those comments from Andy Cook that I mentioned earlier, the new Chief Inspector of Constabulary. So basically what he's saying is, when people are poorer, they are more likely to commit crime. I do half wonder whether that's not a very insulting comment to those that are struggling financially. But more alarming to me is this idea that police officers should use discretion when it comes to street crime, when it comes effectively to shoplifting. And I worry what sort of door that opens up. Well, Parm Sandhu, former Chief Superintendent in the Met, joins me on this. Just to begin, I mean, what on earth have the Met been doing over these Downing Street parties? You know, the Sue Gray report had to be suspended. What have they been thinking?
I think that now that it's ended, that will be a good start for careers to restart and for people to get on with their jobs. I think everybody's getting bored with Partygate. It's just gone on for such a long time.
No, I think the general public, we were in Hull last week and people were very bored with Partygate, and now that Labour are in some trouble, it's kind of neutralised it politically. But my question is about the Met. There's hardly been clear, decisive leadership from the Met on this, has there? It
has been quite confusing with, are the Met going to investigate it or aren't they? And the cost of the investigation, it wasn't a quick investigation. It's taken many, many months, and a number of detectives that could have been doing other jobs. They've been taken away from frontline policing, helping people who need them, who are in crisis, and looking at fixed penalty notices, which is not really acceptable at all.
No, and what about Andy Cook? What about this new Chief Inspector of the Constabulary? I mean, he's the regulator, effectively, you know, for the 43 police forces across the country and how they behave and what they do, and that's where many complaints would go from members of the public. There may well be a link between increased poverty and crime, although, as I say, I think that's quite insulting to many poorer people. But, I mean, how do you use discretion with a shoplifter?
Police officers have always been able to use discretion. It's nothing new. But what is being suggested here is, if you get a person who is stealing food to eat, not to feed a drugs habit, but to eat, should we be clogging up the court system with that person, or should we be looking at what help that person needs? Because normally police get involved when there's a crisis. So it might be that person
But how would you judge it? How would you judge it? I mean, you talked about police officers' time being used up over potential fixed penalty notices. I mean, what do? You say, right, OK, we've caught you with a loaf of bread, you know, under your overcoat. We're now going to go through your bank balance. We're now going to find out what your financial state of affairs is. How on earth, on the spot, can a police officer make that decision?
I think that decision can be made, because if you've got a pensioner or a person who's trying to feed their family and they have stolen a loaf of bread, you need to direct them to food banks, social services. You do need to get involved with that family as a police officer, but do you really need to criminalise them? Shouldn't you be looking at a way out?
Where do you draw? I mean, you know, is somebody who could afford a year ago, you know, to have 3 or 4 bottles of wine a week and, you know, roast twice a week and steak on a Thursday and fish and chip takeout on a Friday, but now has trimmed that down a bit. I mean, where do you say that somebody is so poor they're allowed to shoplift? That's the problem.
But no one's saying that. No one is saying that you're allowed to shoplift. But what Andy Cook has tried to say is that each case has to be judged on its own merit. Because if you've got a person who's shoplifting every day, of course they're going to be charged. But if you've got a person who's driven to desperation, and I don't think that Andy Cook is saying that poor people are criminals. However, poor people can become criminalised if the criminal justice system is used against them more than others, and that's where we need to be really careful, because some of these individuals, we've got a crisis at the moment, we've got a cost of living crisis. Some of these individuals are genuine people who work hard, who are driven to desperation, and they just might need some help.
I don't doubt how difficult things are, and they're probably going to get quite a lot worse. I just wonder, finally, is this not soft policing? Is this not sending a message that actually, if you go and shoplift and you tell the copper, you know what, I'm really poor and struggling, he'll let you off?
Police officers aren't there just to present people to the courts. You'd have nothing going to court. You wait 2 years to get a rape to court at the moment. You know, cybercrime affects 50% of the people, and yet we haven't got enough police officers to go and visit burglary victims. So if you're clogging up the system with the little old pensioner who's got a loaf of bread, that's not right. That's where discretion has to come in. You've got to have those checks and balances in, and police officers are there to help the public, not just to lock them up. There's two parts to policing.
Well, that's a very, compassionate angle that you put there. I have to say, Parm, I'm still very concerned that it is opening the door potentially to a lot of people thinking I can get away with this, but we will see. Thank you for joining me on the programme.